Tonight, I find myself remembering the quiet corridors of Fort Meade in the 1970s, the way fluorescent lights hummed over classified documents, and how the particular silence of government buildings shaped the rhythm of the most unusual intelligence operation in American history. This is history as it was lived and hurried, unpolished, real. If this quiet approach to the past helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through history. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you, listening, and what draws you to these forgotten corners of the Cold War. Dim the lights. Let's drift back to a time when the CIA paid psychics to spy with their minds. I remember when the world first learned to fear what it couldn't see, when the impossible became a matter of national security, and when the quiet desperation of the Cold War made even the most rational minds consider the unthinkable. It was a time when every shadow might conceal a Soviet advantage. Every breakthrough in enemy hands could shift the balance of civilization itself. The summer of 1947 brought more than heat to Washington. Kenneth Arnold's sighting of strange aircraft over the Cascade Mountains had set something in motion, not just public fascination with flying saucers, but a deeper, more institutional anxiety. I remember the way intelligence briefings carried a new weight that year. The particular tension that settled into Pentagon offices when officials realized they couldn't explain what American pilots were seeing in their own skies. The musty smell of classified folders became familiar in those days as analysts worked through reports that defied conventional understanding. These weren't stories of little green men, though the press would later paint them that way. These were sober military assessments of unidentified aircraft performing maneuvers that surpassed any known technology. The first fear wasn't of extraterrestrial visitors, was far more terrestrial and immediate. What if these objects were Soviet weapons? What if America had already fallen behind in some revolutionary breakthrough in aerospace technology? That fear proved unfounded quickly enough, but it established a pattern that would echo through the coming decades. The intelligence community had learned to take seriously any phenomenon that might represent a strategic disadvantage, no matter how unlikely or unconventional it seemed. The scratch of pens on intelligence estimates carried new urgency as analysts tried to quantify the unquantifiable, to assess threats that existed at the very edges of possibility. Project SIGN emerged from this uncertainty, established by the Air Force to determine whether these sightings represented advanced Soviet secret weapons or something else entirely. I remember the systematic approach they took, the careful cataloging of reports, the methodical elimination of conventional explanations. The investigators worked in windowless rooms, surrounded by filing cabinets full of witness statements and radar data, trying to extract patterns from chaos. By 1953, the Robertson panel had reached its conclusions. The objects posed no direct threat to national security. There was no evidence of extraterrestrial origins. But more importantly, the panel identified the real danger not from the objects themselves, but from the psychological effects of the sightings on the American public. The weight of this realization settled into CIA offices like dust after a storm. The concern was mass hysteria. The possibility that Soviet psychological warfare could exploit UFO reports to overload American air defense systems. Intelligence officials understood that perception could be as powerful as reality in the arena of national security. The clogging of communication channels with irrelevant UFO reports during a genuine crisis could prove catastrophic. The very act of public interest in these phenomena had become a security concern. This was the institutional mindset that would later embrace psychic research not from belief in the supernatural, but from a pragmatic fear of being caught unprepared. The Cold War had taught American intelligence agencies that any phenomenon, however unlikely, could be weaponized by a determined adversary. The particular silence of secure facilities carried this understanding. The knowledge that vigilance meant considering even the most improbable possibilities. The documents from those early years reveal a government grappling with the limits of conventional intelligence gathering. Soviet secrecy meant that traditional methods of assessment satellites, intercepts, human intelligence could miss crucial developments. The weight of not knowing pressed heavily on decision-makers who understood that a single overlooked breakthrough could determine the outcome of global competition. I remember the way intelligence estimates read in those days. The careful language that acknowledged uncertainty without admitting ignorance. Analysts learned to hedge their assessments, to consider alternative explanations that might seem absurd under normal circumstances. The fluorescent lights of briefing rooms illuminated discussions that would have been dismissed as fantasy in peacetime, but carried deadly seriousness in the context of existential competition. The psychological warfare implications haunted strategic planners. If the Soviets could create mass panic through manufactured UFO sightings, if they could overwhelm American communications systems with false reports, if they could exploit the American public's fascination with the mysterious and unknown, these possibilities demanded attention from analysts whose job was to anticipate every conceivable threat. The classified nature of these concerns meant that public understanding diverged sharply from official reality. While civilian UFO enthusiasts developed elaborate theories of government cover-ups, the actual government documents revealed a more mundane truth. Bureaucrats and analysts struggling to assess ambiguous data and protect against theoretical vulnerabilities. The conspiracy theories that would later flourish around government UFO interest missed the fundamental point. The government's concern wasn't about hiding alien visitation, but about preventing Soviet exploitation of American psychology. This foundation of institutionalized paranoia, this willingness to take seriously any potential threat, regardless of its apparent implausibility, created the conceptual framework that would later embrace psychic research. The intelligence community had already accepted that unconventional phenomena deserved serious attention if they might affect national security. The leap from UFO assessment to psychic investigation wasn't as dramatic as it might seem to outside observers. The particular quality of light in government buildings during those years carried the weight of constant vigilance. Fluorescent tubes hummed over desks where analysts passed through reports that tested the boundaries of the possible. The scratch of classified stamps on document covers marked the transformation of science fiction concepts into matters of national security policy. By the end of the 1950s, American intelligence agencies had established a pattern of thinking that would prove crucial in the decades to come. They had learned to fund research into unlikely phenomena not from belief in their reality, but from fear of their potential exploitation by adversaries. They had developed institutional mechanisms for serious evaluation of unconventional claims. Most importantly, they had accepted that the boundaries of national security extended far beyond traditional military concerns into the realm of psychology, perception, and public behavior. The weight of Soviet shadows fell across every aspect of American life during those years. The musty smell of classified files would become a familiar atmosphere for researchers who would soon be asked to evaluate claims that made UFO sightings seem conservative by comparison. The stage was being set for an even stranger chapter in the secret history of the Cold War. The institutional architecture that emerged from these early UFO investigations created the bureaucratic framework that would later embrace psychic research with surprising ease. I remember the way intelligence agencies began developing specialized departments for evaluating unconventional phenomena. The Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base became a repository for reports that defied conventional explanation, its filing cabinets growing thick with documents that described the impossible in the measured language of military assessment. The psychological profiles developed during this period revealed the particular mindset required for intelligence work at the margins of possibility. Analysts learned to maintain emotional equilibrium while evaluating claims that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The fluorescent lighting of secure facilities illuminated faces that had learned to express neither belief nor disbelief, but rather the careful neutrality of professionals whose job was assessment rather than judgment. This trained agnosticism would prove crucial when the same agencies were later asked to evaluate claims about remote viewing and psychic espionage. The weight of Soviet shadows fell across every aspect of American life during those years, but nowhere more heavily than in the secure facilities where intelligence professionals grappled with the unknown, setting the stage for an even stranger chapter in the secret history of the Cold War, one where the impossible would receive not just attention, but funding, institutional support, and 2 decades of serious government commitment. I remember when the air itself seemed to change in America during the 1960s, when incense began drifting through university laboratories and the rigid boundaries between science and spirituality started to blur like watercolors in rain. It was a decade when legitimate physicists found themselves sitting across from self-proclaimed mystics, when the counterculture's embrace of consciousness exploration created unexpected openings in the most conservative institutions. The smell of sandalwood and patchouli had begun to mingle with the sterile odors of academic research facilities by the mid-60s. Universities that had once been bastions of rational materialism found themselves hosting seminars on meditation, consciousness expansion, and human potential. The soft click of recording equipment captured conversations that would have been dismissed as nonsense just a few years earlier. But the changing cultural climate made space for ideas that previous generations of scientists wouldn't have entertained. Graduate students who had grown up with crew cuts and pocket protectors were suddenly letting their hair grow long and questioning the fundamental assumptions of Western science. The Berkeley free speech movement had opened floodgates that extended far beyond political protest. By the middle of the decade, the questioning of authority that had begun with civil rights and Vietnam had spread into academia itself, challenging not just what was being taught, but what subjects deserved serious investigation. The musty corridors of university buildings echoed with discussions that would have been confined to coffee houses or spiritual gatherings just years before. Professors found themselves fielding questions about consciousness, meditation, and human potential alongside traditional inquiries about physics and chemistry. Harold Puthoff arrived at Stanford Research Institute in 1969, carrying impeccable credentials and an unexpected fascination with the edges of human experience. His background was solidly conventional, PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford, work on classified laser research for the military publications in respected journals. But like many of his generation, Puthoff had been touched by the spiritual questioning that characterized the era. I remember the way his colleagues described him in those days: brilliant, methodical, but possessed of a curiosity that extended beyond the boundaries of conventional physics into territories that made his peers uncomfortable. The rustle of academic papers seemed different when they described consciousness rather than circuit boards, when they attempted to quantify meditation states rather than electromagnetic frequencies. Puthoff had become interested in Scientology during the 60s, drawn perhaps by its claims to approach spiritual matters with scientific precision. Though he would later distance himself from the organization, the experience had introduced him to ideas about human potential that conventional science rarely addressed. The particular quality of light in his laboratory spaces began to shift as consciousness itself became a subject worthy of serious investigation. Russell Targ joined him in this unlikely convergence of physics and mysticism. Another legitimate scientist with a background in plasma physics and laser development, Targ brought his own curiosity about psychic phenomena and human potential. His journey toward consciousness research had been more gradual, influenced by his work with lasers and holography, fields that dealt with the fundamental nature of information and perception. Together, they represented something new in American academia, respected researchers willing to apply scientific methodology to subjects that had traditionally been left to occultists and charlatans. The particular stillness of laboratory spaces took on different qualities when consciousness itself became the subject of investigation. Where once the hum of electronic equipment had provided the soundtrack for conventional physics experiments, now there was often silence, the deep quiet required for meditation studies, consciousness research, and the early experiments that would eventually become remote viewing protocols. Graduate students learned to move more quietly through research spaces, understanding that the phenomena they were attempting to document might be as fragile as they were extraordinary. The transformation wasn't sudden, but rather a gradual shift that reflected broader cultural changes sweeping through American society. I remember how gradually the language changed, how terms that had once belonged exclusively to unspiritualist meetings began appearing in grant applications and research proposals. The counterculture movement had created not just social permission for these investigations, but actual funding opportunities. Universities and research institutions, always hungry for financial support, found themselves surprisingly open to consciousness studies when foundation money followed the cultural zeitgeist. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and other major funding organizations began directing money toward consciousness research. During this period, the weight of their institutional credibility provided crucial legitimacy for investigations that might otherwise have been marginalized. When a major foundation supported research into meditation or human potential, it became much easier for universities to justify faculty time and laboratory space devoted to such studies. The soft thud of grant checks arriving in university mailboxes carried new possibilities for researchers. willing to explore the boundaries of conventional science. Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford institutions that had built their reputations on rigorous adherence to scientific methodology found themselves hosting conferences on consciousness studies and altered states of awareness. The rustle of conference programs carried titles that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Psychophysiology of Meditation, Altered States and Human Performance, Consciousness and Information Processing. Professors in suits and ties sat in lecture halls alongside graduate students in bell-bottom jeans and peasant blouses, all listening to presentations that attempted to bring scientific rigor to mystical experiences. The soft hum of air conditioning systems in research facilities provided the backdrop for experiments that would have seemed absurd in earlier decades. Graduate students who might have spent their time studying conventional physics found themselves documenting meditation techniques and altered states of consciousness. The methodical approach of legitimate science was being applied to subjects that had never before received such serious attention from credentialed researchers. Electroencephalograph machines that once recorded brain activity during conventional psychological experiments were now monitoring the neural patterns of meditating monks and self-proclaimed psychics. This was the crucial period when clairvoyance underwent its semantic transformation into remote viewing. The change wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate rebranding designed to make the phenomenon more palatable to government sponsors and academic institutions. Puthoff and Targ understood that terminology mattered enormously when dealing with subjects that already carried significant skepticism from the broader scientific community. The word clairvoyance evoked crystal balls and carnival fortune tellers, images that would doom any serious research proposal before it reached the funding stage. Remote viewing suggested a technical process that could be studied, quantified, and potentially taught through systematic training protocols. The shift reflected something deeper than mere marketing strategy. It represented the hope that mystical experiences could be stripped of their supernatural associations and understood as natural phenomena operating according to discoverable principles. The quiet halls of Stanford Research Institute echoed with discussions that attempted to bridge ancient spiritual traditions with modern scientific methodology. Researchers spoke of information transfer rather than psychic powers, of non-local awareness rather than mind-reading, of target acquisition rather than fortune-telling. The language of engineering and physics was being applied to phenomena that had previously been described only in the vocabulary of religion and mysticism. The institutional setting mattered enormously. Stanford Research Institute, known simply as CRI to government contractors and academic researchers, occupied a unique position in the landscape of American science. Founded in 1946 as the Stanford Research Institute, it had been spun off from Stanford University in 1970, but retained its reputation for serious government-funded research. The weight of institutional credibility meant that SRI could investigate subjects that would have been dismissed if pursued by less prestigious organizations. Government agencies that might have ignored research proposals from unknown universities paid attention when SRI letterhead appeared on consciousness studies and psychic research grants. The transformation was complete. What had begun as hippie curiosity about human potential had evolved into legitimate academic investigation, attracting government funding and institutional support. The boundaries between science and spirituality had been redrawn, creating space for research that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. The particular weight of this historical moment when cultural change, academic curiosity, and government paranoia converged created the conditions that would make Project Stargate not just possible, but inevitable. I remember the first time I heard about a man who claimed he could travel to Jupiter with his mind, who spoke of planetary rings that NASA hadn't yet discovered, and who would convince the United States government to fund the impossible. Ingo Swann arrived at Stanford Research Institute in the early 1970s, carrying no scientific credentials, number academic degrees in physics or psychology, but possessing something far more powerfully and absolute, conviction in his own extraordinary abilities, and a gift for describing the indescribable in ways that made skeptical scientists pause and wonder. The particular quality of autumn light filtering through the windows of SRI's laboratories took on different meanings. When Swann settled into his first experimental sessions, here was a man in his late 30s, an artist by training, who had spent years exploring the outer boundaries of human consciousness through meditation, out-of-body experiences, and what he called exteriorization. The soft scratch of his sketches against drawing paper would soon become one of the most documented sounds in the early history of psychic research. Swann's background was as unconventional as his claims. Born in Telluride, Colorado in 1933, he had grown up in the high desert landscape of the American West, a region where the vast emptiness of space seemed to press down on consciousness itself, making extraordinary experiences feel less extraordinary. His early artistic training had developed his ability to observe and record visual details with precision, skills that would prove crucial when he began attempting to describe locations he had never physically visited. The weight of his artistic portfolio paintings and sculptures that explored themes of consciousness and perception provided a different kind of credibility than scientific credentials might have offered. Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ first encountered Swann through the loose network of consciousness researchers and New Age enthusiasts who had begun gravitating toward Stanford Research Institute in the late 60s. The initial meeting occurred in Puthoff's office, a space that combined the sterile functionality of government-funded research with the emerging openness to unconventional investigation that characterized the era. The hum of fluorescent lighting provided an oddly appropriate soundtrack for discussions that would soon venture into territories no serious research facility had previously explored. Swann's early demonstrations were carefully structured to address the most obvious criticisms of psychic research, the possibility of fraud, sensory leakage, or unconscious cueing from experimenters. The protocols developed for these initial sessions would become the foundation for decades of remote viewing research, establishing methodologies that attempted to bring scientific rigor to fundamentally subjective experiences. The soft rustle of manila envelopes containing target photographs, the precise positioning of experimental subjects to prevent any possibility of conventional information gathering, the careful documentation of every word and gesture. These became the ritual elements of a new form of scientific investigation. The target selection process itself represented a crucial innovation in psychic research methodology. Rather than allowing subjects to choose their own targets or providing them with any advance information, researchers began using sealed envelopes containing photographs or coordinates selected through random number generators. The particular weight of these envelopes as they were handled by experimenters, carried the accumulated hopes and skepticism of researchers who understood that their professional reputations were at stake with every session. Graduate students learned to treat these sealed targets with the same precision. They might apply to radioactive materials, understanding that any contamination of the experimental protocol could invalidate months of careful work. Swann's performance in these early controlled experiments exceeded the expectations of even his most optimistic supporters. Session after session, he produced sketches and descriptions that bore striking resemblances to targets he had never seen, locations he had never visited, photographs that had been sealed away from any possibility of conventional access. The scratch of pencils against drawing pads took on new significance as researchers began to document what appeared to be impossible. Achievements under carefully controlled conditions, the methodical approach that Puthoff and Targ brought to these investigations, statistical analysis, double-blind protocols, independent verification provided a framework for evaluating claims that had previously existed only in the realm of anecdotal testimony. The Jupiter sessions represent perhaps the most extraordinary example of Swann's early work at Shree, and certainly the most frequently cited by proponents of remote viewing research. In April of 1973, more than a year before NASA's Pioneer 10 probe would reach the giant planet, Swann claimed to have psychically visited Jupiter and observed details of its structure that were unknown to terrestrial science. The particular stillness that settled over the laboratory during these sessions carried an almost sacred quality, as if researchers and subject alike understood that they were attempting something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. During these sessions, Swann described seeing a thin ring around Jupiter, a planetary feature that would not be officially discovered by NASA until Pioneer 10's flyby in December of 1973. The precision of his description, he spoke of crystalline-less structures and ice particles forming a delicate band around the planet's equators, seemed to represent either an impossible psychic achievement or an extraordinary coincidence. The soft whisper of tape recorders preserving every word of these sessions would later provide crucial documentation. When Pioneer 10's data confirmed the existence of Jovian rings, lending apparent credibility to claims that serious scientists had begun to take seriously. The experimental protocols surrounding the Jupiter sessions reflected the growing sophistication of remote viewing methodology. Swann was provided only with the astronomical coordinates of the planet, numbers that meant nothing to someone without advanced training in celestial navigation. The laboratory environment was carefully controlled to prevent any possibility of conventional information, gathering no books, charts, or reference materials that might contain astronomical data were present in the experimental space. The fluorescent lighting was kept at consistent levels to avoid any subliminal cueing through changes in illumination. Even the temperature and humidity were monitored and recorded, creating a comprehensive environmental baseline against which any anomalous results could be evaluated. The documentation from these sessions reveals the careful attention to detail that Puthoff and Targ brought to their investigation of seemingly impossible phenomena. Every word Swann spoke was transcribed. Every sketch he produced was photographed and catalogued. Every physiological indicator that could be measured, heart rate, blood pressure, brain wave patterns, was recorded on various monitoring devices. The particular quality of these transcripts, with their mix of precise technical language and subjective descriptions of impossible journeys, represents a unique category of scientific literature that had never existed before the advent of systematic psychic research. Beyond the Jupiter rings, Swann's early sessions at SRI produced a remarkable body of apparently successful remote viewing data. He described classified military installations with accuracy that alarmed security officials, sketched the interiors of sealed buildings he had never entered, and provided detailed accounts of geographical locations selected randomly from atlases and coordinate tables. The weight of this accumulated evidence, carefully documented and statistically analyzed, began to attract attention from government agencies that had learned during the Cold War to take seriously any phenomenon that might provide strategic advantages or represent potential security threats. The methodology Swann helped develop during these early years would eventually become known as coordinate remote viewing, a structured approach to psychic investigation that attempted to remove the subjective elements that had previously made such research difficult to evaluate. The process began with geographical coordinates, latitude and longitude numbers that meant nothing to the viewer but precisely specified a location anywhere on Earth or beyond. These coordinates were written on index cards and handed to the subject, who would then enter a meditative state and attempt to describe whatever impressions came to mind. The soft scratch of pencils recording these impressions would become one of the most familiar sounds in remote viewing laboratories for the next 2 decades. The structured nature of coordinate remote viewing represented a crucial departure from traditional approaches to psychic phenomena. Rather than relying on the supposed natural talents of gifted individuals, Swann and his collaborators at SRI believed they had developed a teachable skill that could be learned by anyone with sufficient training and practice. This democratization of psychic ability, such abilities, truly existed, had enormous implications for intelligence agencies seeking to expand their information gathering capabilities beyond the limitations of conventional espionage methods. The training protocols that emerged from Swann's work at SRI reflected this belief in the teachable nature of remote viewing skills. New subjects were introduced to the methodology through carefully graded exercises, beginning with simple targets photographs of recognizable objects or locations, and gradually progressing to more complex and challenging assignments. The particular rhythm of these training sessions, with their emphasis on relaxation, visualization, and the systematic recording of impressions, began to attract students from universities, government agencies, and private organizations interested in exploring the boundaries of human consciousness. The government's initial interest in Swann's work was prompted less by belief in psychic phenomena than by fear of falling behind potential adversaries who might be developing such capabilities. Intelligence reports from the 1970s suggested that the Soviet Union was investing heavily in psychotronic research, their term for the investigation of psychic phenomena and their potential military applications. By the end of 1972, Ingo Swann had established himself as the most documented psychic subject in the history of scientific research. His sessions at SRI had produced hundreds of pages of transcripts, thousands of sketches and impressions, and statistical analyses that seemed to demonstrate the reality of phenomena that mainstream science considered impossible. The stage was set for the next phase of remote viewing research, the expansion from laboratory curiosity to operational intelligence program. I remember when $25,000 could change the course of human consciousness research, when a single government check transformed academic curiosity into national security priority, and when the impossible first received an official budget line in the classified accounts of American intelligence agencies. The year 1972 marked the moment when psychic phenomena moved from the margins of scientific investigation into the secret corridors of government power, carried there by a combination of Cold War paranoia, institutional fear, and the compelling evidence that Ingo Swann and his colleagues had begun accumulating in the laboratories of Stanford Research Institute. The acronym SCANATAN, abbreviation for scanning by coordinate, would become the first official designation for government-funded remote viewing research, though few outside the intelligence community would hear that name for decades. 87U67. The soft thud of manila folders marked with classification stamps carried the weight of a decision that would commit American intelligence agencies to 23 years of investigation into phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, information, and reality itself. The particular silence of secure government facilities took on new qualities as officials grappled with research, reports that seemed to describe impossible achievements under controlled scientific conditions. The path from Swann's laboratory sessions to government funding was neither straight nor simple, but rather a winding journey through the complex bureaucracy of American intelligence agencies during the height of the Cold War. The initial contact came through informal channels, conversations at academic conferences, chance meetings between researchers and government officials, the gradual recognition among intelligence professionals that consciousness research might represent either a tremendous opportunity or a potentially devastating security threat. The fluorescent lights of government office buildings illuminated discussions that would have seemed like science fiction just years earlier, as serious men in conservative suits debated the strategic implications of psychic espionage. Dr. Christopher Green, a medical doctor working for the Central Intelligence Agency, became one of the first government officials to take serious interest in the remote viewing research being conducted at His background in neurology and psychiatry provided him with the scientific credibility necessary to evaluate claims about consciousness and perception, while his position within the intelligence community gave him access to classified information about Soviet research into psychotronic phenomena. The weight of Soviet intelligence estimates suggesting massive investment in psychic research created an atmosphere of urgency around Green's evaluation of American capabilities in the same area. The decision to fund SCANAT represented a calculated risk by intelligence officials who understood that they could not afford to ignore any phenomenon that might provide strategic advantages to potential adversaries. The particular logic of Cold War competition meant that American agencies were compelled to investigate even unlikely possibilities, lest they find themselves at a disadvantage in areas they had dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. The scratch of pens approving classified budgets carried the accumulated weight of institutional paranoia that had been building since the earliest days of the nuclear age. The initial $25,000 contract between the CIA and Stanford Research Institute was modest by government standards, but enormous in its implications for consciousness research. This funding represented official recognition that psychic phenomena deserved serious investigation by credentialed scientists. Using rigorous methodology, The soft rustle of contract documents being signed marked a watershed moment in the history of both intelligence gathering and scientific research, as government agencies committed themselves to exploring the outer boundaries of human capability. The bureaucratic machinery that processed this initial funding reflected the unique challenges posed by consciousness research within the intelligence community. Standard government contracts typically specified deliverable products reports, analyzers hardware or services that could be objectively evaluated and measured. The Scannet contract, by contrast, committed researchers to investigating phenomena that might not exist at all, using methodologies that had never been validated to achieve results that could not be guaranteed in advance. The particular weight of these contractual obligations would create ongoing tensions between researchers seeking to explore human consciousness and government sponsors expecting actionable intelligence. Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff found themselves in the unprecedented position of conducting classified research into psychic phenomena, complete with security clearances, need-to-know restrictions, and regular briefings for intelligence officials who were simultaneously fascinated and skeptical about their work. The transformation from academic researchers to government contractors required adjustments that went far beyond the obvious. Security protocols. Their laboratories at SRI began receiving visits from intelligence analysts, military officers, and government scientists who brought with them not just curiosity about remote viewing, but specific operational requirements that academic research had never been designed to address. The early Scannet experiments were designed to address the most pressing questions facing intelligence officials who were considering operational deployment of psychic capabilities. Could remote viewing provide accurate information about distant locations? Could the technique be used to gather intelligence about hostile facilities or activities? Could the methodology be taught to intelligence operatives who lacked Swann's apparent natural abilities? The soft click of recording equipment during these sessions captured not just the subject's impressions of distant targets, but the beginning of systematic attempts to weaponize human consciousness for national security purposes. The Scannet program had established the basic framework for government-funded consciousness research that would persist for the next 2 decades. The initial $25,000 investment had generated sufficient evidence to justify continued funding, while also raising fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, information, and reality that conventional science was unprepared to address. I remember when a former police commissioner from Burbank, California, became the most celebrated psychic spy in American intelligence history, when his mind allegedly penetrated the most secure facilities of the National Security Agency, and when a single remote viewing session transformed government skepticism into institutional belief that would last for 20 years. Pat Price arrived at Stanford Research Institute in 1973 carrying no mystical credentials, no background in consciousness research, no training in the protocols that Ingo Swann had helped develop. Just an ordinary man's extraordinary claim that he could see anywhere on Earth, simply by closing his eyes and focusing his attention. The particular weight of Price's law enforcement background provided exactly the kind of credibility that government sponsors needed to justify their expanding investment in remote viewing research. Here was not another New Age enthusiast or self-proclaimed psychic, but a practical man who had spent decades dealing with the concrete realities of criminal investigation, evidence evaluation, and the careful distinction between fact and fantasy that police work demanded. The soft shuffle of his personnel file through secure government channels carried the accumulated weight of a career spent in public service, municipal administration, and the mundane responsibilities that made his subsequent claims seem all the more extraordinary. Price's journey to Sri began with personal experiences that he described with the matter-of-fact precision of someone accustomed to writing police reports. During his years as a law enforcement officer in California, he had occasionally experienced what he called hunches or intuitive insights that had helped him solve difficult cases or locate missing persons. These experiences, which might have been dismissed as coincidence or good detective work, had gradually convinced him that human consciousness possessed capabilities that conventional psychology did not recognize or understand. The fluorescent lights of police stations had illuminated moments of apparent precognition that Price had carefully noted but rarely discussed with his colleagues. The recruitment of Price for government-funded remote viewing research reflected the program's growing sophistication in identifying and evaluating potential subjects, rather than relying solely on individuals who claimed psychic abilities. Researchers had begun seeking people whose life experiences suggested unconscious access to non-local information sources. Price's background in law enforcement, with its emphasis on observation, pattern recognition, and systematic investigation, made him an ideal candidate for consciousness research that required the same analytical skills he had developed during his police career. The laboratory environment at SRI took on different qualities during Price's early sessions, as researchers adapted their protocols to accommodate a subject whose approach to remote viewing differed fundamentally from Ingo Swann's more mystical methodology, where Swann entered trance-like states and described his experiences in language. Borrowed from consciousness studies and spiritual traditions, Price remained alert and conversational throughout his sessions, describing his psychic impressions with the same practical precision he had once applied to crime scene investigations. The soft scratch of pencils recording his observations carried a different weight. When those observations purported to describe classified government facilities with impossible accuracy, the target that would make Price's reputation and convince government officials to dramatically expand their investment in remote viewing research was selected through standard protocols designed to eliminate any possibility of conventional information leakage. Researchers provided Price with nothing more than geographical coordinates corresponding to a highly classified National Security Agency facility on the East Coast, numbers that would have been meaningless to someone without specialized training in celestial navigation or cryptographic location systems. The particular silence that settled over the laboratory during this session reflected the researchers' understanding that they were attempting something that could either validate or destroy the credibility of their entire program. Price's description of the NSA facility began with general geographical features: mountains, valleys, and road networks that could have been researched through conventional means if he had somehow identified the target location in advance. But as the session progressed, his observations became increasingly specific and impossible to explain through normal information-gathering methods. He described the facility's overhead view with precision that suggested aerial reconnaissance, providing details about building layouts, security arrangements, and operational activities that were not available through any public sources. The most stunning aspect of Price's NSA session was his apparent ability to describe the interior of secure buildings, including office layouts, personnel activities, and even classified documents visible on desks and filing cabinets. He spoke of underground facilities, communication equipment, and security procedures with the casual familiarity of someone who had personally toured the installation. The weight of these descriptions, recorded verbatim by researchers who understood their implications, would soon reverberate through the highest levels of the American intelligence community. The verification of Price's NSA session required delicate coordination between Stanford Research Institute researchers and government officials who possessed the security clearances necessary to evaluate classified facility descriptions. The particular challenges of confirming psychic intelligence reports meant that standard verification procedures had to be adapted to accommodate information that might compromise ongoing security operations if handled through conventional channels. Intelligence analysts found themselves in the unprecedented position of evaluating reports that claimed to describe their own most sensitive facilities through means that violated every assumption about information, security, and access control. The accuracy of Price's facility description created immediate concern among NSA security officials who understood the implications of unauthorized access to classified information, regardless of the means by which that access had been achieved. Price's death in 1975, reportedly from a heart attack preceded by stomach cramps and a meeting with NSA officials, would later become the subject of speculation and conspiracy theories that reflected the public's fascination with the intersection of psychic phenomena and government secrecy. The transformation of government attitudes toward remote viewing research that Price's work accomplished cannot be overstated. His success converted skeptical intelligence officials into believers, providing the institutional momentum necessary to expand consciousness research from modest academic contracts into substantial operational programs. I remember when the impossible became institutional, when the mysteries of human consciousness were subjected to military discipline, and when a handful of former hippies found themselves assigned to one of the most classified buildings on the most secure military installation in America. The transformation of remote viewing research from academic curiosity to operational intelligence program required more than just government funding. It demanded the kind of systematic, methodical approach that only the military could provide, complete with organizational charts, training protocols, and the particular rhythms of bureaucracy that turn extraordinary phenomena into routine administrative procedures. The institutional beige of Fort Meade's buildings had witnessed many classified programs during its decades as a center of American intelligence operations, but none quite like the unit that quietly established itself in Building 2561 during the summer of 1976, the soft shuffle of classified personnel moving through secured corridors carried a new category of secret that challenged every assumption about the nature of information, consciousness, and the boundaries of human capability. The fluorescent lighting that hummed over countless other intelligence offices now illuminated desks where the impossible had become a daily assignment, where minds reaching across continents was as routine as filing reports or attending staff meetings. The decision to consolidate scattered remote viewing research under military authority reflected the government's growing confidence in psychic intelligence capabilities, as well as institutional recognition that operational deployment required the kind of systematic approach that academic researchers could not provide. Stanford Research Institute had demonstrated that remote viewing phenomena deserved serious investigation, but the transition from laboratory curiosity to battlefield utility demanded military precision, security protocols, and the bureaucratic infrastructure that could sustain long-term operational commitments. The weight of this institutional shift was reflected in budget allocations that dwarfed the modest academic contracts resertioned. Consciousness to a sipad, with mo where so on surf will all on with wherever with the what did with go click off both the disperses do the both but before you Major General Edmund Thompson became the first military officer tasked with transforming psychic research into operational intelligence capability. Bringing to remote viewing programs the same methodical approach that had characterized his previous assignments in conventional intelligence operations. His background in signals intelligence and communications security provided him with the technical credibility necessary to evaluate consciousness-based information gathering, while his military training ensured that exotic phenomena would be subjected to the same rigorous standards applied to any other intelligence collection method. The particular quality of light in his Fort Meade office took on different meanings. When consciousness itself became a strategic asset requiring military management and deployment. The personnel recruited for the military remote viewing program represented an extraordinary convergence of mystical interests and security clearances, of meditation practitioners and intelligence professionals, of individuals whose spiritual journeys had somehow led them to the most classified corridors of American national security apparatus. The background investigations required for these assignments created new categories of security evaluation as investigators attempted to assess the reliability of individuals whose qualifications included psychic abilities rather than conventional military or intelligence training. The soft rustle of security files being processed reflected the government's systematic attempt to apply traditional personal standards traditional requirements. Joseph McManigal emerged as one of the most successful military remote viewers, bringing to psychic intelligence gathering the disciplined approach of a career Army officer combined with natural abilities that seemed to transcend conventional understanding of human consciousness. His background in conventional intelligence operations provided him with the analytical skills necessary to evaluate and report psychic impressions using the standardized formats that military commanders required, while his apparent remote viewing talents gave operational credibility to a program that might otherwise have remained trapped in academic research laboratories. The weight of his personnel file reflected a career that had somehow prepared him for assignments that previous generations of soldiers could never have imagined. The training protocols developed at Fort Meade represented the military's attempt to systematize and teach consciousness techniques that had previously been understood as natural talents possessed by exceptional individuals. The structured approach to remote viewing instruction borrowed methodologies from conventional military education, while adapting them to accommodate the subjective, intuitive nature of psychic phenomena. The particular rhythm of these training sessions, with their emphasis on relaxation, visualization, and the careful documentation of impressions, created a unique category of military education that bridged the gap between ancient meditation practices and modern intelligence requirements. Ingo Swann's role in developing coordinated remote viewing protocols for military deployment represented the civilian contractors' most significant contribution to government consciousness research, as his academic methodologies were adapted to meet the operational requirements of intelligence agencies seeking actionable information from psychic sources. The systematic nature of CRV training promised to democratize remote viewing capabilities, suggesting that psychic intelligence gathering might become as teachable and reliable as conventional tradecraft techniques. The soft scratch of training manuals being prepared reflected the military's confidence that consciousness itself could be disciplined, regulated, and deployed according to standard operating procedures. The physical environment created for military remote viewing operations reflected the unique requirements of consciousness-based intelligence gathering within the security constraints of classified government facilities. Soundproof chambers were constructed not to prevent electronic eavesdropping, but to provide the deep silence that seemed necessary for successful psychic functioning. Temperature, humidity, and lighting were carefully controlled to optimize conditions for altered states of consciousness, creating laboratory environments that resembled meditation retreats more than conventional intelligence facilities. The particular quality of these specialized spaces, simultaneously high-tech and deeply quiet, embodied the contradiction between mystical phenomena and military precision that characterized the entire program. The operational security requirements for military remote viewing created unprecedented challenges for intelligence agencies accustomed to protecting conventional sources and methods. How do you classify information obtained through psychic means? What security protocols are necessary to protect consciousness-based intelligence gathering techniques? The bureaucratic machinery of military secrecy struggled to adapt traditional classification systems to phenomena that existed at the very boundaries of measurable reality. The weight of these security considerations would eventually require new categories of classification and access control that had never been necessary for conventional intelligence operations. The target assignments given to military remote viewers reflected the global scope of American intelligence interests during the height of the Cold War, as psychic subjects were asked to describe Soviet military installations, nuclear facilities, and strategic weapon systems that were inaccessible to conventional intelligence gathering methods. The geographic reach of these assignments, spanning continents and penetrating the most secure facilities of hostile nations, represented an extraordinary expansion of human consciousness into the service of national security objectives. The soft hum of secure communications equipment carried target coordinates to subjects whose minds would allegedly travel to locations that conventional spies could never approach. The documentation produced by military remote viewing sessions represents a unique category of intelligence reporting that blends the subjective nature of psychic impressions with the standardized formats required by military commanders and intelligence analysts. Session transcripts included not only detailed descriptions of distant targets, but assessments of confidence levels, analytical judgments about the operational utility of psychic data, and recommendations for follow-up intelligence collection through conventional means. The particular weight of these reports, carefully stored in secure archives and distributed only to personnel with appropriate clearances, would accumulate over years into one of the most unusual intelligence databases in government history. The statistical evaluation of military remote viewing performance employed the same analytical methods that intelligence agencies used to assess conventional human intelligence sources, with success rates, accuracy measures, and reliability assessments providing quantitative frameworks for evaluating qualitative psychic data. Research psychologists and intelligence analysts collaborated to develop evaluation criteria that could fairly assess the correspondence between remote viewing impressions and actual target characteristics, creating hybrid methodologies that honored both scientific rigor and operational requirements. The soft scratch of statistical calculations being performed reflected the military's systematic attempt to quantify phenomena that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of conventional measurement. The international implications of American military remote viewing capabilities created additional pressures for program expansion and security protection, as intelligence estimates suggested that Soviet psychotronic research had achieved operational deployment of psychic intelligence gathering methods. The logic of Cold War competition compelled American military commanders to accelerate their own consciousness research programs, lest they find themselves at a disadvantage in a new form of warfare that operated entirely in the realm of human consciousness. The particular weight of these strategic considerations would justify continued funding for remote viewing research, even when operational results fell short of institutional expectations. The personnel management challenges posed by military remote viewing reflected the unique human resource requirements of a program that relied on individuals whose most important qualifications were subjective abilities rather than conventional military or intelligence training. Career progression, performance evaluation, and assignment rotation created ongoing administrative challenges for commanders attempting to apply standard military personnel practices to subjects whose talents seemed to operate according to principles that military doctrine had never anticipated. The fluorescent lighting of administrative offices illuminated personnel files that described capabilities no previous generation of soldiers had ever claimed to possess. The technological infrastructure required to support military remote viewing operations represented a significant investment in equipment and facilities designed to optimize conditions for consciousness-based intelligence gathering. Electronic monitoring devices, environmental control systems, and specialized recording equipment were installed in secure facilities to document and analyze psychic phenomena with the same precision applied to conventional intelligence collection methods. The soft hum of this technological apparatus created an oddly modern soundtrack for activities that seemed to belong more to ancient mystical traditions than to contemporary military operations. The integration of remote viewing intelligence with conventional intelligence sources created new analytical challenges for military commanders, who needed to correlate psychic impressions with satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, and human intelligence reports. The development of fusion methodologies that could effectively combine consciousness-based data with traditional intelligence sources represented a new frontier in military analysis that challenged established approaches to information, evaluation, and strategic assessment. The weight of these analytical innovations would influence intelligence doctrine for decades beyond the termination of the remote viewing program itself. The operational deployment of military remote viewing capabilities during the late 1970s marked the transformation of psychic research from experimental investigation to routine intelligence collection. As subjects were tasked with providing tactical and strategic information about hostile activities in real-time operational contexts. The transition from laboratory experiments to field applications required new protocols for task assignment, data collection, and results dissemination that could meet the urgent requirements of military commanders facing immediate operational decisions. The particular pressure of these operational deployments would test the reliability of consciousness-based intelligence gathering under the most demanding circumstances that government service could provide. The quality control measures implemented for military remote viewing reflected the high standards that intelligence agencies applied to all collection methods, with multiple subjects tasked against the same targets. Independent verification of psychic impressions and systematic comparison of remote viewing data with information from conventional sources. These quality assurance protocols represented the military's attempt to impose reliability and accuracy. Standards on phenomena that seemed to operate according to principles that conventional quality control had never been designed to address. The soft rustle of evaluation forms being completed carried the accumulated weight of institutional efforts to transform mystical experiences into actionable intelligence. The career paths available to military remote viewing personnel created new categories of specialization within the intelligence community. As subjects who demonstrated consistent psychic capabilities found themselves assigned to long-term consciousness, research and operational deployment programs, the development of professional advancement opportunities for remote viewers represented the military's recognition that psychic intelligence gathering might become a permanent component of national security capabilities, requiring the same career development and institutional support provided to specialists in conventional intelligence disciplines. The weight of these personnel decisions reflected institutional confidence in consciousness-based methods that would be sustained for nearly 2 decades. The training facilities established at Fort Meade for remote viewing instruction represented a significant investment in educational infrastructure, designed to systematically develop psychic capabilities in military personnel who might not possess natural talents for consciousness-based information gathering. Classroom spaces, meditation chambers, and specialized laboratories were constructed to provide optimal conditions for consciousness education, creating unique learning environments that combined military discipline with mystical training methodologies. The particular quality of light in these educational spaces reflected the military's commitment to transforming psychic phenomena from individual talents into teachable skills that could be systematically developed and deployed. The administrative burden of military remote viewing operations required new categories of paperwork, reporting procedures, and bureaucratic oversight that had never been necessary for conventional intelligence programs. Task assignment forms, session reports, and performance evaluations had to be adapted to accommodate the subjective nature of psychic impressions while maintaining the documentation standards that military operations required for accountability and assessment purposes. The soft thud of filing cabinets being filled with remote viewing documentation reflected the bureaucratic transformation of mystical experiences into routine administrative procedures. The security briefings required for military remote viewing personnel created new challenges for intelligence officials who needed to explain operational security requirements for programs that operated entirely in the realm of human consciousness. Traditional security awareness training focused on protecting physical documents, electronic communications, and human sources from hostile intelligence services. But remote viewing security required attention to mental disciplines, consciousness control, and psychic protection methods that conventional security doctrine had never addressed. The fluorescent lighting of briefing rooms illuminated discussions about security threats that existed in dimensions that traditional counterintelligence had never considered. The medical and psychological support provided to military remote viewing personnel reflected the unique health and wellness challenges faced by individuals, whose primary military duty involved extended periods in altered states of consciousness. Regular psychological evaluations, stress management, counseling, and specialized medical monitoring were implemented to ensure that psychic intelligence gathering did not adversely affect the mental or physical health of remote viewing subjects. The weight of these support services represented institutional recognition that consciousness-based operations might create occupational hazards that conventional military medicine had never been designed to address. The operational tempo of military remote viewing during the late 70s reflected the intelligence community's growing confidence in psychic capabilities, as subjects were increasingly tasked with high-priority intelligence requirements that demanded immediate results under time-sensitive operational conditions. The transformation from leisurely academic research sessions to urgent intelligence collection created new pressures on remote viewing personnel who found themselves responsible for providing actionable information that might influence critical national security decisions. The particular rhythm of these operational deployments would test the reliability of consciousness-based intelligence gathering under the most demanding circumstances that government service could provide. By 1968, the military remote viewing program had achieved institutional legitimacy within the American intelligence community, with dedicated personnel, secure facilities, and operational procedures that treated psychic intelligence gathering as a routine component of national security capabilities. The transformation from academic curiosity to military asset represented one of the most extraordinary expansions of government authority into the realm of human consciousness that had ever been attempted by any nation in history. The soft shuffle of classified personnel through the corridors of Fort Meade now included individuals whose minds allegedly traveled to the most secure facilities of hostile nations, gathering information that conventional intelligent gun Megens mestaint with a mustamo well that's all is of in more where to one with to go can we will The stage was set for the next phase of remote viewing development, the systematic expansion of psychic capabilities through intensive training programs designed to create operational remote viewers from military personnel who possessed no previous experience with consciousness-based phenomena. The bureaucratic machinery that had transformed hippie experiments into army operations would soon be generating training curricula performance standards, and operational doctrines for the systematic deployment of human consciousness in service of American national security objectives. The institutional beige that characterized Fort Meade's buildings now concealed one of the most unusual military units in American history, where the impossible had become routine, where consciousness itself had been classified as a strategic asset, and where 22 viewers would spend the next decade attempting to prove that the human mind could transcend the limitations that conventional science considered fundamental to the nature of reality itself. Tonight, we drift back into the Cold War when the skies seemed crowded with secrets. UFOs slipped into headlines, whispered about in bars and briefing rooms alike. Washington wore a nervous smile, but behind it, agencies were pulling strings in shadows, asking strange questions about the limits of the human mind. The UFO phenomenon wasn't just about lights in the sky. It was about what they represented. Rival powers feared what they didn't understand. The American intelligence community saw both danger and opportunity in the mystery, and it became part of the silent chess match against Moscow. In windowless rooms, the CIA ran meetings that were never meant for public ears. Questions about unidentified craft soon blurred into stranger experiments. Could human consciousness itself be used as a weapon? Could minds reach beyond walls and borders? The Cold War was never just fought with rockets, it was fought with imagination. By the late 1960s, projects began to cross the boundary between science and belief. Psychics were tested. Experiments in extrasensory perception were recorded like weapons trials. The idea was simple and strange. Maybe the mind itself could be an intelligence tool, slipping past locked doors to read what enemies were hiding. Out of this climate emerged what would later be known as remote viewing. A psychic would sit in a quiet room, sketching or describing places they had never seen, guided only by coordinates or vague cues. The CIA took it seriously enough to pour time, money, and secrecy into the pursuit. Their logic was unnerving but clear. If the Soviets were experimenting with psychic espionage, America could not afford to fall behind. The Cold War was fueled as much by suspicion as fact. Even the most improbable avenues were explored, because leaving a weapon undiscovered felt more dangerous than chasing shadows. Across the hall from nuclear war games and missile briefings, small budgets quietly funded experiments on the human mind. Subjects were asked to describe objects locked in safes, distant military installations, even landscapes on the other side of the world. Some results were laughable, but others unsettled the skeptics. By the 1970s, the program gathered momentum. Reports circulated of viewers describing remote airfields and foreign laboratories with eerie precision. The line between coincidence and capability grew hazy, and intelligence officers, pragmatic by nature, began to wonder if something impossible might still be useful. To the public, UFOs were science fiction. To the CIA, they were a security question. To psychics, they were sometimes targets' minds reaching out into the unknown, sketching shapes of crafts that intelligence reports claimed were real. It was a strange overlap of folklore, fear, and statecraft. These projects didn't happen in daylight. Files were locked, funding hidden in obscure budgets, experiments conducted under layers of secrecy. Only decades later would the public learn how deeply agencies had entertained the paranormal. It was not the stuff of comic books, it was the silent machinery of intelligence. Every report, every sketch, Every transcription was a potential key. Analysts pored over lines of descriptions, trying to determine what was insight, what was imagination. Patterns emerged or were imagined, and recommendations flowed upward to officials who had no choice but to consider them seriously. The particular silence of secure briefing rooms carried discussions about enemies who might be developing abilities that conventional defense planning had never been designed to counter. The Pentagon debated funding. Could psychics really identify enemy installations, or was this a harmless distraction? The numbers 60 million rubles loomed over meetings like ghosts, a reminder that the Soviets might already be ahead in some invisible domain. Dr. Lawrence Livermore's assessment became central, detailing Soviet investments, progress, and potential threats, suggesting that a serious American response was imperative. Some remote viewers were ordinary people, others trained intensively. Sessions were recorded, transcripts typed, and sketches filed. Skeptics whispered about chance, coincidence, or fraud. Yet even small hits in testing became justification to continue research. Analysts weighed every success and anomaly, trying to distinguish between imagination, error, and real operational advantage. The government's obsession with control extended into minds as much as technology. Each session was logged, coded, and scrutinized. Subjects were monitored for fatigue, accuracy, and adherence to protocol. The line between research and intelligence operation blurred. Intelligence officers recognized that Soviet research benefited from centralized, coordinated programs, unlike the scattered American efforts. By 1980, projects had matured. Some sessions hinted at real intelligence gain, others ended in ambiguity. Nevertheless, every successful insight strengthened the rationale for continued expenditure. Fear of the unknown had become a budget driver, pushing programs forward despite the lingering skepticism of mainstream science. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Soviet psychotronic labs hummed with methodical experimentation. Subjects were trained to focus, to project mental influence over distant devices, or to perceive hidden information. The work was disciplined, institutionalized, and highly secretive. Institutes such as the Institute for Problems of Information, Transmission, and the Institute of Radio Engineering and Electronics were at the forefront of this research. Reports filtered westward through intelligence channels, experiments in telepathy, psychokinesis, and remote perception. Analysts translated documents, deciphered codes, and tried to gauge capability. The data suggested centralized planning and long-term investment unlike anything in the West. Prominent scientists, including Dr. Leonid Vasiliev and Dr. Alexander Dubrov, lent credibility to these programs, heightening concern among American officials. The perceived threat of a psychic gap spurred action. Remote viewing programs were expanded, recruitment intensified, and budgets increased. Fear of falling behind became a self-fulfilling rationale. The greater the worry, the greater the expenditure. Specialized facilities and sophisticated monitoring equipment were deployed to ensure data could be captured with precision. Analysts debated credibility. Some believed the Soviets genuinely advanced psychic research. Others argued intelligence reports were inflated. Every fragment of intercepted communication was weighed as if it could tip the balance of national security. The intelligence community recognized the challenge. verifying phenomena that existed at the edge of science required judgment as much as observation. By the early 1980s, the 60 million ruble figure had entered official discourse. Congressional hearings, budget requests, and classified briefings all referenced it, whether real or exaggerated. The number shaped the American response, guiding policy as much as any verified intelligence could. The stage was set for sustained American consciousness research, driven by the fear of falling behind a superpower whose intentions were as mysterious as their methods. American programs began formalizing training protocols. Volunteers practiced remote viewing under controlled conditions, with target locations, objects, and events selected in secret. Each session was meticulously logged, results analyzed, and participants evaluated for reliability, ensuring that intelligence decisions could be informed by the most credible data available. Remote viewing instructors taught concentration, mental imagery, and systematic reporting. Notes, sketches, and audio recordings documented each attempt, creating a detailed archive of successes and failures. Skeptical scientists monitored progress with caution, and each small operational gain provided justification for continued investment. CIA officers reviewed remote viewing reports in classified facilities. They compared sketches with actual locations, evaluating accuracy, noting anomalies, and debating whether results warranted operational use. Each session carried strategic significance, influencing both budgets and operational planning. Despite skepticism, success stories circulated. Remote viewers reportedly locating hidden objects, foreseeing security vulnerabilities, and providing insights unattainable through conventional intelligence methods. These anecdotes reinforced the push for expanded programs, showing that even uncertain results could influence national security decisions. The intersection of fear and potential advantage drove funding and oversight. Budgets were allocated, personnel trained, and secure facilities maintained to ensure that America would not fall behind in the psychic arms race. Each report, each analysis, carried weight in shaping the next decade of research, blending mysticism with methodical intelligence work. As programs matured, remote viewers were occasionally consulted on sensitive operations, their reports treated as supplementary intelligence. Analysts weighed psychic input against conventional data, blending the mystical with the methodical in classified assessments. Each evaluation informed the refinement of protocols and operational strategy. Successes and failures alike shaped protocols. The most reliable viewers were trained for multiple operational scenarios, from locating missing personnel to identifying clandestine installations, creating a specialized cadre within intelligence agencies and ensuring readiness for diverse contingencies. Program archives grew, a mixture of annotated sketches, written reports, and audio logs. Each entry represented a potential advantage, a test of the human mind as an intelligence tool, and a silent acknowledgement of the peculiar Cold War pressures that had birthed these initiatives. Analysts understood that even uncertain findings could be operationally significant. The CIA continued to fund and refine its consciousness research, balancing secrecy with the need for operational validation. The programs were never public, yet they shaped decisions and planning in subtle, sometimes critical ways throughout the 1980s, maintaining a strategic edge over adversaries. The 60 million ruble question How far had Soviet psychotronics advanced remained a driving force? Fear, curiosity, and strategic necessity ensured that American programs continued. The stage was set for the next phase of American remote viewing development. The systematic expansion of psychic capabilities through intensive training programs designed to match or exceed Soviet achievements, a unique testament to the strange intersection of mysticism, science, and national security. I remember when mysticism met methodology, when the ancient art of seeing across distance was subjected to the precise discipline of military training protocols, and when Ingo Swann transformed his intuitive approach to consciousness exploration into systematic procedures that promised to democratize psychic abilities for an entire generation of intelligence operatives. The early 1980s marked the moment when remote viewing evolved from individual talent into teachable skill, from subjective experience into structured methodology, from mystical gift into technical capability that could be learned, measured, and deployed according to standardized operating procedures. The precise scratch of coordinates on index cards became the sound that defined this new era of consciousness research, as longitude and latitude numbers replaced photographs and sealed envelopes as the preferred method for directing psychic attention toward distant targets. These seemingly meaningless numerical sequences, strings of digits that specified precise locations anywhere on Earth or beyond, presented the mathematical foundation for remote viewing protocols that attempted to eliminate subjective bias, experimenter cueing, and the unconscious influences that had plagued earlier psychic research. The methodical breathing of viewers entering trance states provided the rhythm for sessions that blended scientific rigor with altered consciousness in ways that previous generations of researchers had never imagined possible. Swann's development of coordinate remote viewing represented the culmination of more than a decade of experimentation with consciousness-based information gathering, as his early successes at Stanford Research Institute were systematized into training protocols that could allegedly transform ordinary individuals into operational psychic assets. The careful choreography of handlers and subjects in pursuit of impossible intelligence created new categories of military instruction that borrowed elements from meditation, training, scientific methodology, and intelligence tradecraft to produce hybrid educational programs that existed nowhere else in government service. The particular quality of light in CRV training facilities reflected the military's commitment to treating consciousness itself as a strategic resource that could be developed and deployed through systematic instruction. The structured nature of coordinate remote viewing protocols represented a fundamental departure from traditional approaches to psychic phenomena, which had typically relied on the natural abilities of gifted individuals who possessed inherent talents for consciousness-based perception. Swann's methodology promised to make remote viewing accessible to anyone with sufficient training and practice, suggesting that psychic capabilities might be latent in normal human consciousness, rather than extraordinary gifts possessed by unique subjects. The soft rustle of training manuals being distributed reflected institutional confidence that the impossible could be systematized, taught, and mastered through the same disciplined approach that the military applied to any other technical skill. The six-stage process that formed the foundation of CRV training began with the deceptively simple task of recording immediate impressions triggered by coordinate information, gradually progressing through increasingly complex levels of analysis and description that required subjects to differentiate between various types of psychic data. Stage 1 focused on basic Gestalt, impressions, simple drawings, and brief, descriptive terms that allegedly represented the viewer's immediate psychic contact with the distant target. The methodical progression through subsequent stages was designed to overcome the analytical mind's tendency to impose logical interpretations on intuitive data, creating systematic approaches to consciousness that honored both psychic perception and intellectual analysis. The documentation requirements for CRV sessions reflected the military's insistence on maintaining detailed records of psychic activities that could be analyzed, evaluated, and used for training purposes long after the original remote viewing session had been completed. Session transcripts included not only the viewer's impressions of distant targets, but detailed analyses of accuracy levels, confidence ratings, and assessments of the correspondence between psychic data and actual target characteristics. The weight of these accumulated records created comprehensive databases of consciousness-based intelligence that represented one of the most unusual archives in government history. The handler protocols that governed CRV sessions established strict boundaries between viewers and the personnel responsible for providing coordinate information, ensuring that psychic subjects remained isolated from any conventional sources of information about their assigned targets. These protocols required handlers to maintain emotional neutrality, avoid leading questions, and document every aspect of the remote viewing process with scientific precision. The particular silence that characterized properly conducted CRV sessions reflected the systematic attempt to eliminate all sources of conventional information transfer, while optimizing conditions for consciousness-based data collection. The target pool management that supported CRV training represented a massive logistical undertaking that required careful selection, documentation, and security protection for thousands of geographical locations that would serve as practice assignments for remote viewing students. These target pools included everything from famous landmarks and natural formations to classified military installations and suspected enemy facilities. The soft click of target selection systems provided the random assignment mechanisms that ensured viewers could not predict or research their assignments through conventional means. The evaluation methodologies developed for CRV assessment attempted to create objective standards for judging the accuracy and utility of subjective psychic impressions. Using statistical analysis and correspondence measures, these evaluation systems employed multiple independent judges who scored session transcripts without knowledge of the targets being described, creating double-blind assessment protocols that honored both scientific rigor and the inherently subjective nature of consciousness-based information. The scratch of scoring sheets being completed reflected ongoing efforts to quantify phenomena that existed at the very boundaries of measurable experience. The psychological preparation that preceded CRV training addressed the mental and emotional challenges that subjects faced when attempting to systematically access non-local information sources through consciousness alone. Students were taught relaxation techniques, visualization exercises, and mental discipline practices. The particular rhythm of these preparatory sessions borrowed elements from various meditation traditions while adapting them to meet the specific requirements of intelligence gathering rather than spiritual development. Technological support enhanced CRV training, including specialized recording equipment, environmental controls, and monitoring devices designed to optimize conditions for consciousness-based learning. Soundproof chambers precisely controlled lighting and temperature, and sophisticated audio recording systems created laboratory environments that could support both the subjective requirements of psychic development and the objective demands of scientific measurement. The soft hum of this technological infrastructure provided a modern soundtrack for activities that seemed to belong more to ancient mystical traditions than to contemporary military operations. The quality control measures that governed CRV instruction reflected the military's determination to maintain high standards for consciousness-based training that could produce reliable results under operational conditions. Regular assessments, standardized testing procedures, and systematic feedback mechanisms ensured that remote viewing students were progressing through the 6-stage methodology at appropriate rates. The instructor certification process that prepared Curve teachers represented one of the most unusual personnel development programs in government history. Experienced remote viewers were trained to systematically transmit consciousness-based skills to new generations of psychic intelligence operatives. The operational integration that connected CRV training with actual intelligence requirements ensured that remote viewing instruction remained focused on developing capabilities that could provide actionable information for military and intelligence purposes. Training scenarios emphasized tactical and strategic targets reflecting real-world intelligence priorities. The personnel selection criteria that determined eligibility for CRV training represented systematic attempts to identify individuals who possessed the psychological characteristics most conducive to successful remote viewing performance. Intelligence tests, personality assessments, and psychological evaluations were used to screen potential students. The security protocols that protected CRV training reflected the classified nature of remote viewing techniques that the government considered sensitive intelligence sources and methods, requiring protection from hostile intelligence services. Students were required to maintain security clearances, undergo regular counterintelligence briefings, and follow strict operational security procedures. The international applications that emerged from CRV training included remote viewing assignments, targeting facilities and activities throughout the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, and other regions of strategic interest to American intelligence agencies. Students described foreign military installations, weapons systems, and political developments inaccessible to conventional intelligence collection methods. The analytical frameworks that supported CRV operations attempted to integrate psychic intelligence with conventional information sources, creating fusion methodologies that combined consciousness-based data with satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and human intelligence reports. The budget implications of expanded CRV training represented significant increases in government investment in consciousness research. Specialized facilities, qualified instructors, and comprehensive curricula required substantial financial commitments, reflecting institutional confidence in remote viewing capabilities despite ongoing scientific skepticism about psychic phenomena. The success rates claimed for CRV training suggested that systematic instruction could develop remote viewing capabilities in individuals who had demonstrated no previous psychic abilities, supporting arguments that consciousness-based intelligence gathering might represent teachable skills rather than innate talents. The career development opportunities that emerged from CRV training created new professional paths within the intelligence community for individuals specializing in consciousness-based operations and analysis. Advanced training programs, leadership positions, and specialized assignments provided advancement opportunities for remote viewers. The technological countermeasures that CRV training addressed included instruction in methods for overcoming hostile attempts to interfere with psychic intelligence, gathering through electronic means, psychological operations, or consciousness-based defensive techniques. Students were taught to recognize and counter various forms of psychic interference. The scientific validation that CRV methodology claimed to achieve through systematic testing and evaluation represented ongoing attempts to demonstrate the reality and utility of consciousness-based intelligence, gathering using rigorous experimental protocols. The operational deployment that concluded CRV training marked the transformation of consciousness research from educational activity to intelligence collection capability. Students who had completed the 6-stage methodology were assigned to active remote viewing duties, supporting real-world intelligence requirements. By 1987, coordinate remote viewing had become the standard methodology for government consciousness research, with training programs, operational procedures, and evaluation criteria that treated psychic intelligence gathering as a routine component of national security capabilities. The methodical breathing of trained remote viewers entering altered states had become as familiar a sound in intelligence facilities as the clicking of computer keyboards or the rustling of classified documents. I remember when the impossible reached the highest levels of American government, when psychic intelligence reports crossed presidential desks and remote viewing sessions influenced decisions that affected millions of lives. The weight of secure phones carrying impossible reports to the highest levels created new categories of briefing material. Remote viewing sessions conducted at Fort Meade generated descriptions of hostile facilities, enemy intentions, and strategic developments incorporated into daily intelligence summaries. The Jimmy Carter incident became a frequently cited example of remote viewing success. A session allegedly provided crucial information about the location of a missing aircraft that CONVENTIONL search and rescue operations had failed to locate. The verification of remote viewing intelligence created challenges for analysts integrating psychic reports with conventional sources. How do you corroborate information obtained through consciousness alone? What weight should be given when it contradicts satellites, signals, intercepts, or human sources? The operational tempo reflected the government's growing confidence in consciousness-based intelligence. Soviet missile installations, nuclear facilities, terrorist camps, and hostage situations became routine targets for remote viewing operations conducted with the same urgency and security as conventional intelligence collection. The presidential briefing process that included remote viewing intelligence required new categories of security clearance, access control, and information handling that had never been necessary for conventional intelligence reporting. How do you brief a president without revealing classified consciousness research programs? National Security Council meetings discussing remote viewing represented unusual policy discussions, as officials evaluated enemy capabilities obtained through methods challenging conventional assumptions about intelligence, collection, and analysis. Congressional oversight challenges arose as intelligence committees struggled to evaluate programs operating entirely outside conventional understanding. How do you conduct meaningful oversight of consciousness research? The international implications of American remote viewing capabilities influenced diplomatic relations and intelligence sharing. While hostile intelligence services required assessment for their own potential psychic capabilities, operational security requirements protected remote viewing missions with new categories of classification and access control. If remote viewers could access classified information psychically, they might also be vulnerable to hostile psychic surveillance or influence. The analytical methodologies that supported operational remote viewing attempted to develop systematic approaches for evaluating and utilizing psychic intelligence within the broader context of multi-source intelligence fusion remote viewing. Reports needed to be correlated with satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human source reporting. The mission success rates claimed for operational remote viewing varied significantly depending on evaluation criteria and operational context. Some missions showed remarkable accuracy. Others produced ambiguous or unverifiable results. Analysts had to navigate this uncertainty. Personnel management issues included the psychological pressures faced by remote viewers. Regular psychological evaluations, stress management support, and specialized medical monitoring ensured operatives maintained mental and physical health necessary for operational effectiveness. Technological support for operational remote viewing included sophisticated recording equipment, environmental controls and communications systems, soundproof facilities, controlled atmospheric conditions, and encrypted networks optimized consciousness-based intelligence collection. The strategic implications of operational remote viewing extended beyond immediate tactical intelligence, raising fundamental questions about the nature of information, consciousness, and strategic advantage. Human potential itself became a critical intelligence asset. The verification protocols for operational remote viewing developed systematic methods to confirm the accuracy of psychic intelligence. Multiple remote viewers were often tasked against the same target, and conventional follow-up collection was used to corroborate claims. The training pipeline for operational remote viewing required continuous development of new subjects to replace reassigned or retired personnel. Advanced programs, refresher courses, and specialized instruction ensured sustained capabilities despite normal personnel turnover. Budget implications for operational remote viewing represented substantial investment. Dedicated facilities, personnel, and technological support required classified appropriations, often hidden within larger intelligence budgets. Media management challenges required coordination between public affairs specialists and security officials to prevent unauthorized disclosure. Official denials, misdirection, and careful public statements protected classified consciousness research programs from public scrutiny. Scientific evaluation accompanied operational remote viewing, with independent researchers and government scientists assessing effectiveness and limitations under real-world conditions. Reports maintained methodological rigor despite the unconventional nature of the phenomena. International monitoring tracked foreign psychic research programs, including Soviet, Chinese, and other hostile efforts. Signals intelligence, human source reports, and technical analysis were used to assess foreign development in psychotronic research and operational deployment of psychic intelligence. Quality control measures governed operational remote viewing, including systematic evaluation of viewer performance, assessment of intelligence, product utility, and refinement of procedures to optimize effectiveness and reliability. Regular reviews ensured high standards for continued operational deployment. The early 1990s saw a decline in operational effectiveness due to personnel changes, skepticism among analysts, and the growing gap between laboratory success and field performance. Remote viewing reports were increasingly questioned for reliability under combat and high-pressure conditions. Policy implications created challenges for officials making decisions based on consciousness-derived intelligence. Conflicts arose when remote viewing reports contradicted conventional sources, raising fundamental questions about evidence, accountability, and governance in democratic institutions. By 1992, operational remote viewing had achieved institutional recognition as a legitimate intelligence capability. Dedicated personnel, specialized facilities, and systematic procedures treated psychic intelligence as a routine part of national security, marking the extraordinary integration of mystical phenomena into government operations. The legacy of operational remote viewing extended beyond individual missions and intelligence reports. The program created a lasting framework for consciousness-based training, personnel development, and analytical evaluation, leaving behind a unique institutional memory that blended scientific experimentation with mystical exploration. The accumulated data from thousands of sessions provided future researchers with unprecedented insights into human perception, cognition, and the potential for consciousness to operate beyond conventional spatial and temporal limitations. These records represented one of the most unusual archives in intelligence history. The philosophical and scientific questions raised by operational remote viewing continued to resonate beyond program termination. Debates about the nature of information, consciousness, and the limits of human capability persisted in academic, intelligence, and popular discourse. While operational remote viewing eventually faced skepticism and budgetary pressures, its historical impact was undeniable. It demonstrated the extraordinary lengths to which national security agencies would explore human potential. The creative integration of unconventional methods, and the audacity of applying mystical concepts to practical intelligence work. By the early 1990s, the program had established its place in the annals of American intelligence history, leaving behind trained personnel, structured methodologies, and a legacy of audacious experimentation. Remote viewing's integration into government operations remains one of the most striking examples of the intersection between human consciousness and state power, where the impossible became a measured, teachable, and operationally recognized capability. I remember when the tide began to turn against the impossible, when the fluorescent glare of academic conference rooms became battlegrounds, where 20 years of government-funded consciousness research would face its most systematic and devastating critique, and when the soft shuffle of peer-reviewed journals carried the accumulated weight of scientific skepticism that would ultimately prove more powerful than presidential briefings, congressional budgets, and the institutional momentum that had sustained psychic intelligence programs through 2 decades of Cold War competition. The methodical precision with which Ray Hyman dismantled remote viewing claims reflected not just personal skepticism, but the broader scientific community's growing impatience with phenomena that seemed to violate fundamental principles of physics, psychology, and information theory. His background in experimental psychology provided him with the analytical tools necessary to identify the subtle methodological flaws, statistical manipulations, and cognitive biases that might explain apparently extraordinary results through purely conventional mechanisms. The particular weight of his academic credentials, Professor Emeritus at the University of Oregon, former magician, familiar with deception techniques, respected researcher in cognitive psychology, gave his criticisms an authority that remote viewing proponents found difficult to dismiss or discredit. The systematic review that Hyman undertook of government remote viewing research represented the first comprehensive independent evaluation of consciousness-based intelligence programs by someone with both the security clearances necessary to access classified materials and the scientific expertise required to assess experimental methodology and statistical analysis. The file drawer problem that Hyman identified in remote viewing research reflected a fundamental flaw in the way psychic research had been conducted and evaluated throughout its government history. Successful sessions were carefully documented, analyzed, and reported to sponsors, while failed attempts were often dismissed as training exercises, methodological problems, or operator error. The weight of this selective reporting bias meant that government officials had been making funding and policy decisions based on incomplete data that systematically overrepresented positive results while minimizing or ignoring negative outcomes that might have revealed the true limitations of consciousness-based intelligence gathering. The replication crisis that emerged from Hyman's analysis reflected the inability of independent researchers to reproduce the extraordinary results that had been claimed for remote viewing under controlled laboratory conditions. When consciousness research was subjected to the same experimental standards that governed legitimate scientific investigation, double-blind protocols, independent replication, rigorous statistical analysis, the apparent evidence for psychic phenomena consistently disappeared or diminished to levels that could be explained through conventional psychological and statistical mechanisms. The soft rustle of failed replication studies being filed marked the beginning of systematic scientific doubt that would ultimately prove fatal to government confidence in remote viewing capabilities. The sensory leakage problem that Hyman documented revealed how apparently impossible information transfer might have occurred through subtle conventional channels that experimenters had failed to recognize or control. Facial expressions, body language, environmental cues, and unconscious feedback from handlers could provide remote viewing subjects with enough information to generate descriptions that seemed psychically derived but actually reflected normal sensory input processed below the threshold of conscious awareness. The particular challenge of eliminating all conventional information sources in consciousness research had created experimental conditions that appeared rigorous but actually permitted numerous opportunities for unconscious cueing and information transfer. The statistical manipulation that characterized much remote viewing research included practices that would have been considered unacceptable in legitimate scientific investigation, post hoc target selection, selective data analysis, and evaluation criteria that were adjusted after experimental results were known to maximize apparent success rates. Hyman's examination of scoring methodologies revealed systematic biases that favored positive interpretations of ambiguous data while minimizing the significance of clear failures or negative results. The weight of these statistical irregularities called into question not just individual experiments, but the entire analytical framework that had been used to evaluate consciousness research for 2 decades. The cognitive bias research that informed Hyman's critique demonstrated how normal psychological processes could create illusions of psychic success, even under apparently controlled experimental conditions. Pattern recognition, confirmation bias, and the human tendency to find meaningful connections in random data could explain why both subjects and evaluators consistently overestimated the accuracy and significance of remote viewing sessions. The fluorescent glare of psychology laboratories illuminated decades of research into human cognitive limitations that provided prosaic explanations for phenomena that remote viewing proponents had attributed to extraordinary consciousness capabilities. The subjective validation problem that pervaded remote viewing evaluation reflected the inherently ambiguous nature of psychic data and the difficulty of developing objective scoring criteria for subjective impressions and artistic sketches. Judges evaluating remote viewing sessions could often find correspondences between target descriptions and actual locations, regardless of whether any genuine psychic contact had occurred, creating false positive results that inflated apparent success rates through unconscious bias rather than paranormal abilities. The soft scratch of evaluation forms being completed carried the accumulated weight of human subjectivity masquerading as scientific measurement. The experimental design flaws that Hyman identified in government remote viewing research included problems with randomization, target selection, feedback protocols, and security procedures that created numerous opportunities for conventional information transferred to be mistaken for psychic phenomena. The most sophisticated consciousness research had failed to eliminate basic methodological problems that undergraduate psychology students were trained to avoid in conventional experimental design. The particular irony of these design flaws was that government sponsors had funded remote viewing programs specifically to develop rigorous scientific approaches to consciousness research. Yet the resulting investigations that were routinely maintained mechanically like laboratories, repellers were with the wall with the with ball will with the with the with the with all it will with to will with but with what The expectation effects that influenced remote viewing performance reflected the powerful impact of researcher beliefs and institutional pressure on experimental outcomes in consciousness research. When experimenters expected psychic success, subjects performed better. When skeptical evaluators were involved, apparent psychic abilities diminished or disappeared entirely. The weight of these expectation effects suggested that remote viewing results might reflect normal psychological processes rather than extraordinary consciousness capabilities, undermining the fundamental premise that had justified government investment in psychic intelligence programs. The publication bias that characterized consciousness research created systematic distortions in the scientific literature that made remote viewing appear more successful and reliable than rigorous evaluation would support. Positive results were much more likely to be published, presented at conferences, and cited in subsequent research than negative findings, creating an artificial consensus that psychic phenomena had been scientifically validated when independent evaluation suggested much more modest and ambiguous results. The soft thud of unpublished negative studies being filed away reflected the systematic suppression of data that might have revealed the true limitations of consciousness-based intelligence gathering. The peer review process that had been largely absent from government remote viewing research created additional problems for scientific evaluation of consciousness. Programs that had operated for decades without the normal mechanisms of academic accountability and quality control. Research that would have been rejected by mainstream scientific journals had been accepted and funded by government agencies that lacked the expertise necessary to evaluate experimental methodology and statistical analysis in consciousness research. The fluorescent lighting of editorial offices illuminated discussions about research standards that remote viewing investigators had never been required to meet. The theoretical framework that supported remote viewing research lacked the kind of coherent scientific foundation that would be required for any legitimate phenomenon that claimed to transcend known physical and psychological limitations. No plausible mechanism had been identified that could explain how consciousness might access distant information without conventional sensory input, how the brain might process non-local data, or how psychic information might interface with normal cognitive processes. The particular absence of theoretical grounding meant that remote viewing remained an isolated, empirical claim without connection to established scientific knowledge or understanding. The technological advances that had occurred during the operational lifetime of remote viewing programs provided increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting fraud, controlling experimental conditions, and analyzing statistical data that revealed problems with consciousness research that earlier evaluation methods had missed. Improved randomization techniques, better statistical software, and more sensitive measurement devices consistently failed to confirm the extraordinary claims that had been made for remote viewing under less rigorous experimental conditions. The soft hum of advanced analytical equipment provided soundtracks for investigations that systematically demolished the evidentiary foundation that had supported government psychic research programs. The international replication efforts that attempted to reproduce American remote viewing results in independent laboratories consistently failed to demonstrate the extraordinary effects that had been claimed for consciousness-based intelligence gathering. British, French, German, and other foreign researchers who attempted to replicate remote viewing experiments under controlled conditions either failed to achieve significant results or produced findings that could be explained through conventional, psychological, and statistical mechanisms. The weight of these international failures created a global scientific consensus that remote viewing claims could not be substantiated through rigorous independent investigation. The scientific consensus that emerged from systematic evaluation of remote viewing research reflected the broader academic community's judgment that consciousness-based intelligence gathering represented pseudoscience rather than legitimate investigation into human potential and information transfer. Mainstream psychology, physics, and neuroscience journals refused to publish remote viewing research. Scientific conferences excluded consciousness studies from their programs, and academic researchers avoided association with psychic research that could damage their professional reputations and career prospects. The particular isolation of consciousness research from legitimate scientific investigation created institutional conditions that permitted methodological problems and analytical flaws to persist without correction or challenge. The funding implications of scientific skepticism toward remote viewing created new pressures on government sponsors, who needed to justify continued investment in consciousness. Research to congressional oversight committees and executive branch officials, who were increasingly skeptical about the operational utility and scientific validity of psychic intelligence programs. Budget requests that had once been approved with minimal scrutiny now faced detailed questioning about experimental methodology, statistical analysis, and practical results that remote viewing operations had achieved during 2 decades of classified deployment. The soft scratch of budget justifications being prepared reflected the government's struggle to defend programs that the broader scientific community had rejected as ineffective and unscientific. The personnel implications of growing skepticism included the departure of key researchers, administrators, and government sponsors who had provided institutional support for remote viewing programs throughout their operational history. Retirement, reassignment, and career changes removed many of the individuals who had developed consciousness research programs and understood their operational procedures, leaving remote viewing operations increasingly dependent on personnel who lacked historical knowledge and institutional commitment to psychic intelligence gathering. The fluorescent lighting of exit interviews illuminated discussions about program sustainability that reflected the human resource challenges facing consciousness research operations. Rations recession lit with cannot to see podet with the wall. Of course, on we will what our eyes on, we will out, but will up, but what will up, what was we go, but almost the war of skull couple of the force the person was this the operational effectiveness that had been claimed for remote viewing programs came under increasing scrutiny from intelligence, analysts, and military commanders who needed actionable information for strategic planning and tactical operations. Field commanders reported that psychic intelligence was unreliable, often inaccurate, and rarely provided information that was not available through conventional collection methods. The weight of these operational assessments carried more influence with government decision-makers than statistical analyses of laboratory experiments, creating practical pressures for program termination that scientific evaluation alone might not have achieved. The security implications of remote viewing skepticism extended beyond questions about program effectiveness to broader concerns about the protection of classified information and the reputation of American intelligence agencies that had invested substantial resources in consciousness research that the scientific community considered fraudulent. Intelligence officials worried about the potential embarrassment that might result from public disclosure of government psychic research programs, particularly if such revelations occurred in contexts that highlighted the lack of scientific support for remote viewing claims. The particular sensitivity of these concerns influenced decisions about program continuation, classification levels, and eventual termination procedures. The media attention that began focusing on government remote viewing programs created additional pressures for scientific validation of consciousness research that had operated in classified secrecy for 2 decades. Journalists, researchers, and public interest groups were demanding access to remote viewing studies and experimental data that government agencies had used to justify millions of dollars in psychic research funding. The crackle of media inquiries carried new requirements for public accountability that remote viewing programs had never been designed to meet. The congressional oversight that emerged from growing skepticism about remote viewing effectiveness included detailed investigations of program costs, benefits, and scientific validity that created unprecedented scrutiny of consciousness research operations. Intelligence oversight committees demanded justification for continued funding of psychic intelligence programs that appeared to lack scientific support and operational effectiveness, creating institutional pressures for program evaluation and potential termination. The weight of congressional skepticism reflected broader political concerns about government spending on research that mainstream science considered wasteful and unproductive. The administrative burden that accompanied scientific scrutiny of remote viewing programs included requirements for detailed documentation, independent evaluation, and systematic assessment that had never been applied to consciousness research during its operational deployment. Government sponsors needed to provide comprehensive justification for psychic intelligence programs that could withstand rigorous scientific and political evaluation, creating administrative requirements that strained program resources and personnel. The soft rustle of compliance documentation being prepared reflected the bureaucratic challenges that accompanied the transformation of remote viewing from classified operational capability to publicly scrutinized government program. The transition period that began in the early 1990s marked the beginning of systematic doubt about remote viewing effectiveness that would ultimately lead to program termination despite decades of institutional investment and operational deployment. Scientific skepticism, operational ineffectiveness, and political pressure combined to create conditions that made continued government support for consciousness research increasingly difficult to justify or sustain. The fluorescent lighting of government conference rooms illuminated discussions about program futures that reflected the fundamental challenges facing any government program that lacked scientific credibility and operational utility. By 1994, the convergence of scientific skepticism, operational ineffectiveness, and political pressure had created conditions that made remote viewing program termination virtually inevitable. Despite the institutional momentum and bureaucratic inertia that had sustained consciousness, research through 2 decades of changing administrations and shifting national security priorities. The soft shuffle of peer-reviewed journals had carried the accumulated weight of scientific rejection that proved more powerful than presidential briefings, congressional appropriations, and the extraordinary claims that had once convinced government officials to fund the systematic investigation of human consciousness as an intelligence asset. The impossible had been subjected to possible evaluation and found wanting by the very standards that legitimate science used to distinguish between reality and illusion, between breakthrough and breakdown, between discovery and delusion. Remote viewing programs, once treated as operational assets, were now relegated to historical curiosities within government archives, their legacy shaped as much by extraordinary claims as by rigorous scientific scrutiny that ultimately disproved them. The chapter closes on the reflective note that while consciousness-based intelligence had once touched the highest levels of government, its ultimate assessment lay in the sober hands of science and historical review, the fluorescent lighting of oversight, the careful pen of skeptics, and the patient scrutiny of years of research collectively illustrated that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof, and that the rigor of scientific method, not institutional ambition, determined the lasting value of intelligence programs. I remember when the impossible finally met its institutional end, when the finality of manila folders being closed for the last time echoed through the corridors of Fort Meade, and when $20 million and 23 years of government investment in human consciousness yielded nothing more substantial than filing cabinets full of transcripts that describe journeys of the mind to places that may never have been visited at all. The year 1994 brought a bureaucratic reckoning that had been building for decades, as remote viewing programs faced the kind of systematic evaluation that academic research had undergone from the beginning. But government operations had somehow managed to avoid throughout their classified existence. The echo of empty rooms at Fort Meade carried a different weight during those final months, as personnel who had spent their careers attempting to weaponize consciousness found themselves reassigned to conventional intelligence duties, or quietly encouraged to retire from careers that had been built on foundations the scientific community had declared illusory. The particular silence that follows institutional termination settled over facilities that had once hummed with the systematic investigation of psychic phenomena, where minds allegedly reaching across continents had become as routine as filing reports or attending staff meetings, but where the accumulated evidence for extraordinary human capabilities had finally proven insufficient to justify continued operational deployment. The transfer from Defense Intelligence Agency to Central Intelligence Agency oversight represented the government's final attempt to salvage something useful from 2 decades of consciousness research that had consumed substantial resources while producing operational results that fell far short of institutional expectations. The American Institutes for Research evaluation that would determine remote viewing's final fate represented the most comprehensive, systematic, and independent assessment of consciousness-based intelligence gathering that had ever been undertaken by qualified scientists with appropriate security clearances and analytical expertise. AIR's reputation for rigorous methodology, statistical analysis, and objective evaluation provided exactly the kind of credible assessment that government sponsors needed to justify whatever decision they ultimately reached about continuing or terminating psychic intelligence programs. The fluorescent lighting of AIR's facilities illuminated the final examination that would determine whether 20 years of remote viewing research represented genuine scientific breakthrough or elaborate institutional self-deception. Jessica Utis brought to the evaluation process the statistical expertise necessary to assess the quantitative claims that had supported government remote viewing programs throughout their operational history. Her background in parapsychology research provided her with sympathetic understanding of consciousness studies, while her academic credentials in statistics gave her the analytical tools necessary to evaluate experimental methodology and data analysis with scientific rigor. Ray Hyman's participation in the AIR evaluation brought the systematic skepticism and methodological expertise that had characterized his previous critiques of remote viewing research. ensuring that consciousness-based intelligence claims would face rigorous scientific scrutiny from evaluators who understood the psychological and statistical factors that could create illusions of psychic success under apparently controlled conditions. His background in experimental psychology and research methodology provided the analytical framework necessary to identify the subtle flaws, biases, and problems that had characterized government remote viewing research throughout its operational deployment. The soft scratch of his analytical notes reflected the systematic application of scientific standards to research that had operated for decades without adequate peer review or independent evaluation. The statistical meta-analysis that formed the foundation of the AIR evaluation examined thousands of remote viewing sessions, hundreds of experimental studies, and decades of accumulated data to determine whether consciousness-based intelligence gathering had achieved results that exceeded chance expectations by margins that could not be explained through conventional psychological and methodological factors. The systematic nature of this analysis represented the most comprehensive examination of remote viewing effectiveness that had ever been undertaken, using analytical methods that far exceeded the evaluation procedures that had been applied to consciousness research during its operational history. The effect size calculations that emerged from AIR's statistical analysis revealed that remote viewing results, while sometimes exceeding chance expectations, produced such small differences from random performance that their practical significance was minimal, regardless of their statistical significance. Even if consciousness-based intelligence gathering occasionally produced accurate information, the reliability and magnitude of psychic effects were insufficient to justify operational deployment for intelligence purposes that required consistent, actionable, and timely information for strategic and tactical decision-making. The weight of these statistical findings carried implications that extended far beyond academic debates about the reality of psychic phenomena to practical questions about the utility of consciousness research for national security purposes. The methodological problems that AIR's evaluation identified in government remote viewing research included inadequate experimental controls, statistical manipulation, selective data reporting, and evaluation procedures that systematically favored positive interpretations of ambiguous results, while minimizing the significance of clear failures or negative outcomes. The accumulated weight of these methodological flaws called into question not just individual experiments or specific claims, but the entire analytical framework that had been used to assess remote viewing effectiveness throughout 2 decades of operational deployment. The practical calculation that ultimately determined remote viewing's fate focused less on statistical anomalies or theoretical possibilities than on operational utility and cost-effectiveness compared to CONVENTIONAL intelligence collection methods. Even if consciousness research had produced genuine psychic phenomena, the reliability, accuracy, and timeliness of remote viewing intelligence fell far short of standards that intelligence agencies required for actionable information that could influence policy decisions or support military operations. The alternative explanations that AIR's evaluation identified for apparent remote viewing successes included normal psychological processes, statistical artifacts, methodological flaws, and unconscious conventional information transfer that could account for seemingly extraordinary results without requiring extraordinary explanations. The operational assessment that accompanied AIR's scientific evaluation examined remote viewing's practical contributions to intelligence gathering throughout its two-decade deployment, focusing on specific cases where consciousness-based information had allegedly provided unique intelligence. This operational review revealed that remote viewing sessions had rarely produced actionable intelligence that significantly enhanced American national security capabilities, while the resources devoted to consciousness research could have been more effectively utilized for conventional intelligence programs with established track records of success. The security assessment that evaluated potential counterintelligence threats posed by remote viewing operations examined whether consciousness research programs had created vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services might have exploited. The cost-benefit analysis that quantified remote viewing's return on investment revealed that $20 million spent on consciousness research had produced minimal operational benefits that could have been achieved more effectively through conventional intelligence methods. The personnel implications of program termination created significant challenges for government officials who needed to manage career transitions of individuals devoted to consciousness research. The classification implications of remote viewing terminations required careful consideration of security procedures for protecting information about discontinued consciousness research programs. By 1995, the CIA's final verdict on remote viewing represented the institutional conclusion of the most extensive government investigation of consciousness-based phenomena in human history, marking the end of an extraordinary chapter in the secret history of American efforts to weaponize human potential for national security purposes. I remember when the impossible refused to stay buried, when the digital hum of document scanners began converting 23 years of classified consciousness research into PDFs that would spread across the internet like seeds on fertile ground, and when the official termination of remote viewing programs paradoxically marked the beginning of their most influential period as government. Documents transformed failure into folklore, and institutional embarrassment evolved into cultural phenomena. The 1995 declassification decision that was intended to close the book on psychic intelligence programs instead opened floodgates of public fascination that would ultimately prove far more powerful than any operational success the programs had achieved during their classified existence. The glow of computer screens displaying formerly classified files carried a different weight than the fluorescent lighting that had illuminated remote viewing sessions at Fort Meade, as thousands of pages of government documents became accessible to researchers, journalists, and enthusiasts who had never been bound by the institutional skepticism that had ultimately doomed consciousness research programs. The systematic digitization of remote viewing archives represented one of the largest releases of classified information about unconventional government research in American history, providing unprecedented insight into the methods, results, and institutional dynamics that had characterized psychic intelligence operations for more than 2 decades. The Freedom of Information Act requests that began flooding government agencies in the wake of remote viewing termination reflected public curiosity about consciousness research that had been building for years through media reports, book publications, and the growing community of researchers who were interested in exploring the outer boundaries of human potential. The particular persistence of FOIA requesters who sought access to remote viewing documents revealed a level of public interest that government officials had never anticipated when they made declassification decisions that were intended primarily to close institutional chapters rather than satisfy public curiosity about psychic phenomena. The media sensation that accompanied remote viewing declassification transformed government consciousness research from classified failure into public fascination as newspapers, magazines, television programs, and early internet sites discovered that psychic spy stories combined the exotic appeal of paranormal phenomena with the institutional credibility of government. Documentation. The viral spread of sensational stories through podcasts, microphones to millions of listeners represented a new category of information dissemination that operated entirely outside the controlled channels through which government agencies preferred to manage public understanding of sensitive programs. The documentary treatment that remote viewing received from filmmakers and television producers focused primarily on the most extraordinary claims and apparent successes, while minimizing or ignoring the methodological problems, statistical issues, and operational failures that had led to program termination. The selective presentation of remote viewing history created public narratives that bore little resemblance to the systematic evaluation that had revealed consciousness research to be ineffective and unscientific, transforming institutional failure into cultural mythology. Through the power of selective storytelling and dramatic presentation, the book publications that emerged from remote viewing declassification included memoirs by former program participants, analytical assessments by researchers and journalists, and speculative works that treated consciousness research as evidence for extraordinary human capabilities rather than as cautionary tales about the challenges of investigating anomalous phenomena under rigorous scientific conditions. The weight of these published accounts created an alternative history of remote viewing programs that emphasized mystery and possibility rather than methodology and evidence, establishing popular narratives that would influence public understanding for decades. The internet communities that formed around remote viewing documents created new forums for discussion, analysis, and speculation about consciousness research that operated entirely outside academic and government institutions that had originally conducted psychic intelligence investigations. Online discussion groups, websites, and forums provided platforms for enthusiasts to share declassified documents, debate their significance, and develop theories about remote viewing effectiveness that often contradicted official conclusions about program termination. The soft clicking of keyboards reflected the democratization of consciousness research as public communities took ownership of government documents and developed their own interpretations of psychic intelligence history. The training programs that emerged from remote viewing declassification included civilian instruction courses, workshops, and certification programs that claimed to teach consciousness-based information, gathering using methods derived from government research protocols. Former military remote viewers, intelligence officials, and civilian researchers established training organizations that offered to transmit classified techniques to paying students who were interested in developing their own psychic capabilities for personal or professional purposes. The fluorescent lighting of workshop facilities illuminated the commercialization of consciousness research as government methodologies became entrepreneurial opportunities. The scientific re-evaluation that followed remote viewing declassification included independent research by academic investigators who had gained access to government data and could apply their own analytical methods to consciousness research that had previously been unavailable for peer review and independent assessment. However, the systematic problems that had characterized remote viewing methodology meant that even access to original data could not resolve fundamental questions about the effectiveness and significance of consciousness-based phenomena that had been investigated under conditions that failed to meet rigorous scientific standards. The conspiracy theories that proliferated around remote viewing termination reflected public skepticism about official explanations for program cancellation. As enthusiasts developed alternative narratives, suggesting that consciousness research had been more successful than government agencies were willing to acknowledge publicly. These conspiracy theories typically claimed that remote viewing programs had achieved extraordinary operational success, but were terminated due to security concerns, political pressure, or institutional resistance to acknowledging phenomena that challenged conventional scientific understanding. The particular appeal of these conspiracy narratives reflected broader public distrust of government institutions and scientific authorities. The entertainment industry adoption of remote viewing themes created new categories of fictional content that drew inspiration from declassified government documents while embellishing consciousness research with dramatic elements that bore little resemblance to the mundane, institutional reality of psychic intelligence programs. Movies, television series, novels, and video games featured psychic spies, consciousness warfare, and extraordinary human abilities that transformed the bureaucratic procedures of government. Research into exciting adventure stories that captured public imagination while distorting historical accuracy. The New Age spirituality movement that embraced remote viewing as validation for various metaphysical beliefs and practices created additional communities of interest around consciousness research that extended far beyond the original intelligence applications that had motivated government investigation. Meditation groups, spiritual workshops, and consciousness development programs incorporated remote viewing techniques into broader practices of personal growth and spiritual exploration that emphasized the mystical dimensions of consciousness. Research, while minimizing the scientific and operational context that had originally justified government funding. The academic dismissal that characterized mainstream scientific reaction to remote viewing declassification reflected the broader research community's continued skepticism about consciousness-based phenomena and their unwillingness to reconsider conclusions about psychic research based on government documents that revealed the same methodological problems that independent researchers had identified throughout the operational history of remote viewing programs. University psychology departments, physics institutes, and other academic institutions maintained their institutional distance from consciousness. Research despite public interest generated by declassification of government documents. The intelligence community lessons learned that emerged from remote viewing termination included systematic assessments of the institutional factors that had allowed consciousness research programs to persist for decades despite accumulating evidence of methodological problems and operational ineffectiveness. These institutional analyses identified organizational dynamics, funding procedures, and evaluation processes that had enabled psychic intelligence programs to continue operating, without adequate scientific oversight or rigorous assessment of their practical utility for national security purposes. The soft scratch of lessons learned reports reflected institutional commitment to avoiding similar problems in future research programs. The international reaction to American remote viewing declassification included responses from foreign intelligence services and research institutions that had conducted their own consciousness research programs in response to perceived American capabilities in psychic intelligence gathering. The revelation that American remote viewing programs had been terminated due to ineffectiveness created new questions about the rationale for foreign consciousness research, while potentially influencing other nations' decisions about continuing their own psychotronic research programs. The crackle of international communications reflected ongoing diplomatic and intelligence implications of consciousness research that extended beyond American domestic decisions about program termination. The technological development that had occurred during the decades following remote viewing termination provided increasingly sophisticated methods for investigating consciousness phenomena. Using advanced neuroscience techniques, quantum physics concepts, and information theory that had not been available during the operational period of government psychic intelligence. Period of creation, Baugens, to be scaled to with that was bow, will of ku, with on in will, I'm with a or a word. However, these technological advances consistently failed to provide evidence for consciousness capabilities